I hope everybody is enjoying their dinner. This is the moment for us to hear from our first keynote for the conference, and we are very pleased to have with us this evening Dr. Dominic Packer. He is a professor of psychology and the associate vice provost for research at Lehigh University. He completed his bachelor's degree from McGill University and a PhD from the University of Toronto, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship in the great Midwestern bastion of the Ohio State University. With Jay Van Pavel, Dominic recently published The Power of Us, Harnessing Our Shared Identities to Improve Performance, Increase Cooperation, and Promote Social Harmony. The Power of Us won the William James Award from Division I of the American Psychological Association for the best book of 2022, and the Social Impact Award from the Center for the Science of Moral Understanding. I would also recommend that you check out his Substack newsletter, also called powerofusnewsletter.com, where he has a really neat blog on the stubborn popularity of Myers-Briggs that is really not supported by rigorous research. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Packer.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'll start by saying I'm not an economist. I'm not a scholar who studies philanthropy, at least not directly. And I'm not really a practitioner either. Although recently, because of the vice provost job, I have begun to do fundraising for my university, especially around research. So in a couple of weeks, I'll be joining our provost, and we'll be going to the glamorous city of Scottsdale, Arizona, to try to convince some potential donors to contribute to the research mission of our university, which is a whole new experience for me. And when I talk to our advancement development folks, they often say, you know, it's all about relationships. It's all about building relationships of trust with our donors, and that's why they would want to give. And I feel like a complete amateur and well out of my depth. And then my ears perk up when I hear the word trust, because I do know something about trust. I'm a social psychologist who studies, for the most part, how people's group identities shape their decisions, their feelings, their thoughts, and how they treat each other. And trust is fundamental to that. And so that got me thinking about what I might know that could be relevant to something that otherwise feels, as I said, out of my depth. I asked generative AI to draw me a picture depicting trust, and this is what it presented to me. It's very warm and fuzzy, a big heart, right? Lots of collective goodwill, people shaking hands. And certainly that is a component of trust, but what I'm going to argue tonight is that there's more to trust than that. It's not all warm and fuzzy. Some forms, or at least sources of trust, are not that at all, and yet they're really important because they interact with each other in ways that could be really relevant to philanthropy, although you'll all be much better equipped to figure out how it might be relevant than I am. But it's that kind of trust, the warm and fuzzy kind, that I think our advancement folks are thinking about when they tell me giving, fundraising, courting donors is all about relationships. This is the crest of my university, Lehigh University, and it's got a heart in the middle of the crest, right? So they're thinking very much about relationships. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is the fact that when we think about where trust comes from, it comes from multiple sources or multiple foundations. And this is a scheme that was originally developed by a sociologist, I'd say an economic sociologist, Lynn Zucker, in the 1980s, where she did a largely historical analysis within the United States and argued that there are really three foundations or key sources of trust. One is relationship-based, so who you know, we get to know each other, we learn who's trustworthy, we learn who's not. And even if we're not directly interacting, right, we're in social networks, and we learn who's trustworthy through rumor, through reputation, right? There's gossip, and that serves as a fundamental function. But fundamentally, relationship-based trust is about learning directly that a certain person is trustworthy or not, or potentially a certain organization is trustworthy or not. But the second foundation of trust she discussed was identity-based. These are trust that's grounded in the groups that we belong to, which is most of what I've studied in my career. And third, and most interesting to me at the moment, as a social psychologist at least, is institutional-based trust, which is grounded in much more sort of formal rules and procedures, and something that I know economists do pay more attention to than social psychologists, but it's somewhat of a revelation to social psychologists that institutions actually matter. So what I'm going to do is talk tonight about these three forms of trust, and then conclude by talking about how they actually work together in ways that might actually be quite important. So relationship-based trust is personalized, right? We learn who we can trust, who we can cooperate with, who we can make ourselves vulnerable to on the basis of either direct experience or reputation, right? So you're in a social network, there's certain people in that network who you've had direct experiences with. You learn, yeah, I took them to the airport, and when I need it, they'll take me. And there's another person you realize, actually, I did them a favor, and they're not ever going to reciprocate. And they lower someone in your estimation, and then maybe you gossip to your friend or your neighbor, and it lowers that person in their estimation as well. So it's personalized, right? We really know the people or potentially the organizations that we're interacting with, and we make decisions accordingly about who we want to work with, make ourselves vulnerable to. There are probably cognitive limits on network size. That is, there's probably some limit in the number of people we can get to know and understand how trustworthy they actually are. And there's an evolutionary biologist called Robin Dunbar who estimates, and you might have heard this before, that there's probably a cognitive limit in the human species at about 150. That is, we're only capable of really understanding a social network of about 150 people. And the reason for that is that in order to figure out who's trustworthy and who's a good interaction partner, it's not just about how they treat us, but it's how they treat each other. And so as a network grows, the number of things you need to track grows exponentially. And he derived this number from studying essentially the size of prefrontal cortex in different primate species and correlating that with the clique size, the size of the groups they tend to interact with. And he creates a graph with a line, a regression line, and then when you put the size of the human prefrontal cortex in the graph, it predicts 150. And it turns out that if you look at Facebook group sizes, for example, they're about 150. Now, obviously, people have many more potential friends, technically, quote, friends on Facebook or other social media platforms. But if you actually look at patterns of interaction, human beings do seem to max out around that number. And for a while, at least, companies like Google took this really seriously and created a system where any sort of company group size was capped at about that size. Relationship-based trust gets us a long way as a species, but it obviously has certain pathologies, right? Every form of trust or foundation of trust I'm going to talk about has really positive things associated with it, but some negatives as well. And in the case of relationship-based trust, its pathologies include nepotism and an old boys club, right? So if trust is based on who we know, and we know there are disparities in people's access to resources or access to information, it means that some people are really well connected and have lots of interaction partners with lots of resources where you can have real mutual benefit. Other people will be less lucky than that. They'll be connected to lots of people who don't have as many resources or lack information, right? And so we call this things like the old boys club where, the old boys who are connected get the jobs and everyone else is left out in the cold. And that's one of the downsides of purely relationship-based trust and cooperation. I'm not going to talk a whole lot more about relationship-based trust and cooperation for tonight, except to note that it's really interesting, especially when it becomes difficult. And so this is a really cool book called Industry of Anonymity, which is about how cyber criminals come to trust each other. So on the one hand, you'd think that the internet would be this glorious paradise for criminality, right? This is a place where people can be entirely anonymous, do whatever they want. It turns out that's really difficult if you actually want to be a master criminal, because in order to be a good criminal, you actually have to be able to trust other criminals. And it creates a real problem, a coordination problem, for cyber criminals who need, in order to do their business, to be able to engage in transactions with people who they have real difficulty trusting because they're criminals and they're anonymous. And so this book's all about how they go about solving that problem. And one mechanism, which is super interesting, is they cease being anonymous to each other. And in fact, in some cases, they actually meet up, so they fully are identified to each other, so they have then a mutual guarantee of destruction. That if one person reneges or rats on the other, then it's going to go the other way too. And that's how they solve the trust problem, right? Anonymity, turns out, is not a sort of glorious boon for cyber criminals necessarily. The second form of trust, which is much more my expertise, is identity-based trust. So this is trust founded fundamentally in the groups that people belong to, and especially a shared sense of group membership. This form of trust is different in the sense that it's depersonalized. That is, I don't need to know you particularly. I don't have to interact with you before or know anything about you reputationally. But if I believe we share something in common in the form of a group membership, and I think that you value that group, then it immediately sets the stage for trust and cooperation. And there are lots of experiments, including some I've run in my lab, where you can randomly assign people to groups, and they know it's random, but they immediately feel a bond to that group, and they immediately trust and cooperate more easily with each other simply because they're part of the same group. So it's depersonalized, and it's not grounded in actual knowledge of a person. It's grounded in a shared knowledge that we are part of some social category. And the social category can range from anything like a nationality, a citizenship, an occupational identity, a religious identity, things that are really meaningful to people, but also much more trivial, like the Myers-Briggs inventory, which categorizes people supposedly based on their personality traits. I'd argue it doesn't effectively do that, but that doesn't matter psychologically. The fact that you're grouped as a fellow empath with someone else makes you then trust that person more, like them more. And as I said, we can do this even just randomly. Flip a coin, you're on the red team, you're on the blue team, and you see the same sorts of effects. As Amir noted, thanks very much, my colleague Jay and I wrote a book really fundamentally all about this, The Power of Us, which is all about the power of these group identities to shape everything from really basic perceptual effects. We have experiments showing that people's identities changes what they taste and they smell, all the way up to really large-scale societal phenomena like social change movements, revolutions, and so on. So we wrote this book, and I'm going to distill the sort of fundamental premise of the research that we've done, along with many others, in terms of two quotations with which we start the book. So the first quotation comes from John Locke, who said, "We are all a sort of chameleons that still take a tincture from things near us." This is often rephrased in more modern terms as we are all a sort of chameleons that take our moral character from the people around us. And what he's saying fundamentally is that who we are in any given moment is shaped by the people that we're around. And very often those people are members of a group that we're part of. The second quote is much more contemporary, comes from Zadie Smith, British author, who wrote a book during the pandemic in which, in part, she talks about identity, and she said, "Identity can be defined as the area of interest, as a form in which you have chosen to expend your love and your commitment." And fundamentally, what the research we've done with regard to social identities, what it does is put these two ideas together and say, fundamentally, we are very much shaped by the people around, especially a group that we belong to that we have adopted as our identity, and that when that happens, it shapes or reshapes our motivations. We come to care about that collective and the other people in it more than we otherwise would. So it's both flexible in that it shifts from circumstance to circumstance or situation to situation, and as it shifts, who we are and therefore who else we care about and are concerned with and want to help changes as well. And to illustrate that point, I'm going to tell you about two of my favorite all-time experiments, neither of which I conducted, although we've done similar things in our labs. The first was inspired or came about from a story that's probably familiar to all of you, which has to do with something known as the bystander effect. This is Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese was very famously or infamously a victim of a violent crime in New York City in the 1950s. She was raped and murdered after a prolonged assault by a man in a housing project. And the New York Times the next day reported as a scandal the fact that as this assault had progressed over the course of something like 45 minutes, 37 people in this housing area had heard her cries for help, and not a single one of them had done anything about it. And this inspired a line of research known as the bystander effect by John Darley and Bib Ladinay, one who was at NYU at the time and one was at Princeton, to try to understand how this sort of thing could happen. And the bystander effect is this idea that, sort of ironically, the larger the crowd of people is around an emergency, in this case an assault, the less likely it is that anyone is to intervene. And there's some evidence that this actually is the case, although it's complicated, because if more people are around, the more likely it is someone is there to intervene. But overall, there is something to it, that in a crowd, when something bad happens, there's a couple of reasons why people don't intervene. One is that they think other people will do it for them, so it's not my responsibility. And the other is they look to each other to try to figure out, is this an emergency or not? No one else is reacting, I guess it's not a problem. We now know this story is actually more complicated, although the bystander effect is a thing. The Kitty Genovese story, as reported by the New York Times, was actually quite wrong. First of all, no one knows where they got the number 37 from. Second of all, it's not true that nobody did anything. A later police officer in the NYPD, who was a child at the time, reported that he and his parents called the police. And one of the major factors as to why no one actually showed up to help her was that this was 2 years before the implementation of the 911 system in the United States. And so at the time when you called the police, you'd call the local precinct and try to convince a captain that it was worth them showing up. And nobody did show up, but it wasn't because the neighbors hadn't actually called. Now this is all to set up the study that I really love, which has to do with when do people help? And it turns out that identity plays a big role. So in this case, it's a study of fans of the Manchester United football team in the UK. And football fans, of course, don't have the best reputation, hooligans and so on. So these are all fans of Manchester United. And they come into a lab, I think it was the University of Exeter, and they were asked, they completed a questionnaire, which was designed, among other things, to ask them about themselves and to highlight, remind them, make salient the fact that they were fans of Manchester United. What's your favorite football team? Why you love them so much? Why is Manchester United the best? And so on. Then the experimenter says, the second part of this experiment is going to take place across campus with my colleague in another building. Here's a map of how you get there. Off you go. And so the participants then set off across campus. And I heard earlier today economists don't use deception. Social psychologists do. In this case, there's deception. Somebody, lo and behold, in the path of the participant, runs across the route in front of them, trips, falls, and falls to the ground, clutches their ankle and screams in agony, seemingly significantly hurt themselves. And the question was, does the participant, who's in a bit of a hurry, right, they're trying to get to the next part of the experiment, do they stop to help? Now, there's 3 conditions in this experiment. 1/3 of the time, the person who's, seemingly in distress, and it's the same person in every case, is wearing a Manchester United football jersey. So, is a fellow fan. In a second case or condition, the person is wearing a Liverpool jersey. And Liverpool, importantly, is the arch rival team of Manchester United, right? This isn't just any old outgroup, this is the enemy. And the third condition is the same guy, but he's just wearing a plain t-shirt. So no logo apparent. And you could probably guess where this is going. When they looked at rates of helping, there's a dramatic difference depending on the jersey, right? So these participants were very likely, 92% of them stopped to help the person wearing the Manchester United jersey. Merely 1/3 helped the person wearing the Liverpool jersey, or indeed the plain t-shirt. Now that's probably not hugely surprising when I present this. People are like, oh yeah, people suck. They're very biased, we're parochial beings. But there's a twist. Because I ran another version of the study. And in this study, it's exactly the same, except the questionnaire at the beginning doesn't ask them questions about why they love Manchester United. It asks them questions about why they love football. Why is this the beautiful game? Why is it such a wonderful sport? Why do you love being a fan of football? And football is a higher level identity, right? It encompasses both Manchester United, but also other teams as well. So participants fill out this questionnaire, they set off across campus, somebody trips and falls, is in pain in front of them, and this time the helping data look pretty different. They help the Manchester United and the Liverpool football fan roughly equivalently, and that poor guy in the white t-shirt, well, he still doesn't help much at all. And so this illustrates, first of all, that identities matter when it comes to helping, but also that it's malleable, right? That people's identities shift, and that this questionnaire was able to, temporarily at least, cause them to think of themselves as something bigger than just Manchester United fans, but fans of football more generally. I'll tell you about one more study which I like, and this is in some ways a more scientifically rigorous study. It uses a public goods game, which I suspect almost everyone in the room is familiar with, but in case not, I'll just step through it quickly. So in a public goods game, every member, in this case there'd be 4 members of a group, receives some resource. Let's say in this case they each receive $1. They have a choice to make, and the choice is, do you want to contribute your dollar to the collective good? If you choose to contribute it, it's multiplied by some factor, in this case a factor of 2, and so it becomes, as a collective good, 8. So here we have all 4 individuals choosing to contribute their dollar. Everyone's multiplied by 2. You've got $8 in the collective pool, which is then divided equally amongst everybody. But the reason this is a social dilemma is that it doesn't have to turn out that way. Imagine a case where 3 of the 4 contribute their dollar to the collective good. That becomes 6, but you've got one guy, this jerk, on the left-hand side, who chooses to keep his dollar for himself. The collective good is divided up equally, and you can see that everyone gets $1.50, but one person benefits from that, or does better than everyone else, because he still got his original dollar. So he makes, or ends up with $2.50, while everyone else has $1.50. And of course, every player in this game is faced with that tension. Collectively, we do best if we all contribute. Individually, I do best if you all do, and I choose not to. So in this study, before having people play a public goods game, they had them complete a questionnaire, which actually is sort of an abstract version of public goods games, which is thought to be able to index what's called people's social value orientation, which is more or less like a personality trait. And it classifies people in different ways, but fundamentally it classifies people as either pro-self or pro-social. Someone who's classified as pro-self tends to make decisions in economic game situations really only with regard to their own interests. They largely ignore what happens to other people. They're kind of agnostic. They don't have to be selfish, but they're really just attuned to what they're doing or how well they do. A pro-social person, on the other hand, takes other people's interests into account and is often striving for fairness. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's essentially how it works out. The trick is, in this study, in addition to measuring that, they also randomly assigned people to conditions which made salient whether or not the people they were playing the public goods game with were part of their group or not. So in one condition, they really highlighted, again through a questionnaire, you're playing with fellow group members. In this case, the group was fellow students at their university. In the other condition, they didn't make that salient. They emphasized individual characteristics. And the pattern's really interesting. So this is the number or the percentage of people who contributed in these public goods games. And what you can see is among pro-socials, so these are people with this personality-like trait who tend to take other people's interests into account, the group identity didn't make any difference. They're contributing at high rates regardless. Where it really made a difference is among the pro-selfs. So these are people who've been classified as really just caring about their own interests when they make these decisions. And here, the group identity made a big difference. If they were thinking of themselves as members of a common group with the fellow players, they're contributing just as much or very close to it as the pro-socials. Whereas if they're thinking of themselves as an individual, they're behaving selfishly, which is what you would expect. And what these researchers and we argue in the book is that what's happening here is that the pro-selfs are not becoming more selfish. It's just the self has changed. The self in this case is the group. And as long as they're feeling like, yeah, we're all part of it, and this is part of who I am, they're willing to cooperate. They'd probably be just as selfish to anyone who's not in the group, but for their fellow group members, in that moment, they're willing to cooperate. So that's the power of group identity. One twist, and this is something I mentioned at the beginning, is that identities are powerful when they're shared, right? That's when we feel we can trust people, is when we possess a shared identity. It's not just I think the group matters, but I think you think that too. And so we and others have conducted experiments which manipulate that to really make sure that that is in fact the case. I'll tell you about one study. This was conducted by a PhD student of mine a couple of years ago, I guess more than a couple now, where people played, in this case it was trust games, with in-group partners and out-group partners. So the participant always knows who's who. They know this is an in-group member, they know that's an out-group member. But what we manipulated is whether they knew that their partner knew that they shared a group membership. And so some cases, their partner is aware of the group membership. In other cases, they knew the person they're playing with, even though they're, say, an in-group member, that in-group member doesn't know that they share a group membership. And in that case, it should be harder to extend trust, because although I know we share a group membership, so I kind of like you, I can't expect you to feel the same way about me because you just don't know that we share a group membership. And what you can see in this case, these were amounts given in a trust game in terms of dollars. People, overall, they trust their in-group partners more, but there's a difference between in-group members where they know, they possess that common knowledge, versus in-group members where they know they don't know and therefore lack it and can't necessarily be trusted as much. And we argue that this is one of the reasons why we're so concerned as a species with signaling our identities, right? It's really important to be able to tell who else is in our group. So as a Canadian, I was advised as a teenager traveling to Europe, I should always have a Canadian flag on my backpack. First of all, people think you're friendly, if that's the case. But I'll also say traveling in France as a teenager, when we encountered other Canadians, and this happened to both Jay, my co-author, and I, when we met other young women with Canadian flags on their backpacks, it created an immediate and very helpful bond as an 18-year-old. And of course, the paraphernalia industry around identity signaling, especially when it comes to sports and university sports, is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. Lehigh, that's my university, and we have a Lafayette professor in the room as well. You may not know it, but Lehigh and Lafayette are arch rivals of our own. We have the longest running football rivalry in the United States, at least according to our Lehigh and Lafayette, we do. And at least once a year, there's a lot of friendly competition between the two. So identity-based trust is grounded in these knowledge of shared group memberships, is depersonalized. You don't have to know the person to feel it. It also, of course, has pathologies, and this is something we also talk a great deal about in the book. There's a dark side to identity, which is parochialism, bias, discrimination, right? To the degree we trust us and not them, that causes many a problem that we're all aware of. Third, I want to talk a bit about institution-based trust. So this is trust that's grounded in rules, procedures, structures that help to regulate social interactions. And I have a quote from Lynn Zucker, because I think she articulates it better than I can, from her paper in 1986, where she talks about what's going on with this kind of trust. So she said, if you don't trust your neighbor, and again, I should highlight, she came to this out of a historical analysis from the sort of early 1800s through the present of the United States. If you don't trust your neighbor to participate in a barn raising after your house burns, you have to buy insurance. If you don't trust immigrants to behave according to common understandings and reflect intersubjectivity, then you have to reform city governments to give them less power by formalizing personnel procedures so people don't just hire their own clan. If you don't trust corporations to behave fairly and ethically, then you have to formalize interorganizational relations by enacting antitrust rules. If you don't trust workers, you have to formalize the employee relationship. In other words, what she noted is that as the American society became less homogenous and more heterogeneous, it became harder to rely on you just know everybody, or you happen to share a common group membership, whether it's common religion, common ethnicity. And in order to deal with that, as trust began to degrade in those two ways, people had to create institutions. They had to formalize things in ways that had helped to regulate social interaction. So it includes systems of government, corporate systems, criminal and civil legal systems, contract law, property law, insurance, stock markets, codes of conduct of universities, codes of conduct for conferences, right? All of these are various forms of institutions that help to regulate social interactions. And when they work, when they're effective, help us feel like we can trust each other. Like I kind of know this interaction is gonna be okay because you have incentive to treat me well, because if you didn't, you'd be punished or expelled from the society or whatever it might be. Institutions are, I think, helpful to think about as a continuum. So something is institutionalized to the degree that it's formalized, which means it's probably written down. It's standardized in that it applies in much the same way everywhere, and it's often professionalized. Often institutions involve a lot of training so that the members of those institutions really follow the same set of formalized procedures. And so Zucker talks about some interesting examples of that, medical schools and law schools being two of them. So in 1800 in the United States, there were 3 medical schools, or sorry, 3 law schools. We often think of the founders of the country as lawyers. Most of them were not lawyers in the sense we talk about today. They were not accredited lawyers. They just called themselves lawyers. There were 3 law schools in 1800, 15 by 1900. Medical schools, there's a huge shift into the 1950s from 2-year programs to much more professionalized 4-year programs to become a medical doctor. And in both cases, when you go to a lawyer or you go to a doctor, you are trusting that they have a training that makes essentially what they advise you to do consistent with more or less what any other lawyer or doctor would prescribe. We know that's not 100% true. That's more or less why we trust someone we don't otherwise know, not necessarily part of our group. We assume that the institution of medicine or the institution of law has given them the knowledge they need to do a good job. Give you some more data points about the role that institutions play in producing trust. So there's a great study, it was a longitudinal study in Denmark, which tracked people over time, and what they were able to show is that institutional trust, so trust in the government, the legal system, the courts, and so on, predicted changes in interpersonal trust, how much individuals in the society trusted each other, but not the other way around. So trusting each other didn't cause change, say an increase in institutional trust, but changes in institutional trust predicted changes in how much individuals could trust each other. Similarly, in another study, or set of studies actually, which looks at immigrants' trust, so if someone moves to a new society, they can look at, for example, institutional functioning, which is usually indexed with corruption in the society they're coming from, as well as the society they've moved to. And what they find is that those people's generalized trust, which is essentially their sense that people in general can be trusted, is predicted both by levels of corruption or institutional functioning in the country they're coming from, but also importantly, the new country, right? They're in a new context, and that's changing their levels of trust. If they move to a less corrupt society, they then trust people more generally in that society. Now, obviously, these are really hard things to study experimentally, and this, I think, is probably the only study I know of that did so. It's really cool. So this took advantage of a change in the country of Benin toward land reform. And it was a change from a system of land allocation that was very parochial, based entirely on who you knew. So people would receive essentially farmland if they were well connected, to land reform, which changed that system to a much more formalized bureaucratic system where it was merit-based. And whoever did this had the brilliant insight of instituting it as a randomized control trial. So they randomly selected half of the regions of the country to receive this treatment first. Ultimately, every region underwent land reform, but they instituted over time, and so half of the counties, or communes they're called, were selected randomly to have land reform, the other half waited. And then the research teams were able to go into these areas and conduct, in this case, public goods type games to see what effect land reform had on people's responses. And what you can see on the graph at the bottom is that in these treated areas, people exhibited significantly more cooperation to outgroup members, that is, people who were not members of their village. So being in a place that had undergone land reform, so it was now less parochial, right? It's not based on who you know, or relationships, or shared identities. Instead, it's based on a set of common rules that are applied, at least relatively impartially, is increasing trust in people you don't know, which is a really nice piece of experimental evidence that institutions have this sort of effect. So this brings me to I think what's the most interesting point, at least to me, which is that we've got these 3 foundations of trust: relationship trust, identity-based trust, institutional-based trust. All of them matter, and I think when we think about something with philanthropy, we can think about how those could play out in every case, right? You can think about the fact that when our fundraising team at a university says it's all about relationships, there's some truth to that, right? There's certainly trust that's built up over time through interactions. It's also identity-based, right? This is really obvious. It's known to every telemarketer, every text I get from the Harris campaign, right? They're highlighting some sort of shared identity. I think I've received 5 this afternoon. Right? There's actually an entire class of crime classified by the FBI known as affinity crime, which is crime that specifically targets people based on a common identity. It's often targeted older people, and someone comes to the door and says, hey, you're Mormon, I'm Mormon too. And that immediately makes people more vulnerable because they trust them. And you can think about institutions in the philanthropic domain as well, right? The importance for charitable organizations, for example, to be regarded as trustworthy and have mechanisms of accountability and not to have too much overhead and those things. But what I think is really interesting is something that Zucker noted very tangentially in this article in the 80s, which is these mechanisms are probably what she said was partially substitutable for each other, meaning that they're not all necessarily operative or not equally well, and that sometimes we might use one instead of another. One interesting way in which that might play out that I've been exploring in research over the last few years is that if you're in a situation or society where you have strong institutions that help to provide depersonalized trust, people might rely less on more parochial forms of trust, that is, group-based identities. And so in a lot of my research, I've been interested in prejudice and discrimination. And here the idea is that if you're in a situation where institutions are working well, so people can trust each other because there's good rules and procedures, that they can sort of trust will be enforced fairly, then maybe they're less group-oriented. They don't only extend trust to fellow in-group members because they feel like, hey, everyone in the society is reasonably trustworthy because the institutions are functional. And it turns out there's evidence for this from work we've done and others. This is a study by Joe Henrich and colleagues. They looked at in-group favoring biases across 122 different societies around the world as a function of government effectiveness, which is the inverse of corruptness, and found that as effectiveness goes up, in-group favoring biases go down. And these biases are toward immigrants, toward members of other groups in the society. So in other words, societies with more highly functioning governments, their citizens exhibit less parochial kinds of in-group biases. We did a similar analysis a few years ago. This was looking at anti-immigrant bias among European countries. So there's 32 European countries on this plot, and this is showing you the beta weights for the relationship between trust in social institutions, which included the government, the police, and legal system, and anti-immigrant bias. And what you can see is that in all but 2 cases, it's a negative relationship. And if it's a green bar, it was statistically significant. Overall, it's a whoppingly significant relationship. The better the functioning, or the less corrupt, perhaps I should say, of a society's institutions, actually, in this case, it's self-rated trust, then the less anti-immigrant bias they're exhibiting in those societies. And this is controlling for as many things as we could figure out how to control for. We've done studies in the United States of Black and white Americans. In this case, this was again work by one of my PhD students, large-scale surveys of Black and white Americans, where we asked them lots of questions about trust in different sorts of institutions. And overall, what we found was that the less both Black and white Americans trusted social institutions, the more parochial they wanted to be in interactions. That is, they reported more comfort with same-race than other-race interactions, and a greater preference for same-race interaction partners, especially in trust-relevant domains. So questions like, who do you want your accountant to be or your lawyer to be, where it really matters, right? You want to trust this person. The less they trusted major social institutions, the more they wanted an accountant or a lawyer who is a member of the same race. This is true for both white and Black Americans, roughly equally strongly. Importantly, the reasons for trust or distrust in social institutions were different, and fundamentally, Black Americans, and very unsurprisingly, were deeply concerned about bias in these institutions. And I have a colleague who does really interesting work. Actually, she just left Lehigh for Rutgers. But what she's shown is that negative interactions that Black Americans have with one major institution affects their feelings about other institutions, even though there's not an obvious connection between them. So Black Americans who had negative interaction with a police officer come to trust medical institutions less, which then contributes to them seeking medical help less often, which is a contributor to significant health problems, right? So these things are connected in ways we should be paying attention to. So that's institution-based trust as it intersects with identity, and the fundamental idea being that these things are partially related or substitutable for each other. So it's important to note, and I've been emphasizing the sort of positive side of institutions, in that it can, when they work well, reduce bias, potentially. They have pathologies too, just like relationships do and just like identities do. Institutional pathologies include being rigid or impersonal to the point of dehumanization, right? So we've all been to the DMV trying to get a new driver's license where it feels Kafkaesque. When I moved to the United States, to Ohio, I remember going to the DMV. I had to change my Canadian driver's license to an Ohio one, and I could not convince the woman that Ontario was not an American state, despite the fact she couldn't find it in the book. And we spent half an hour going around in circles. And I remember, so the code for Ontario is ONT, and she was shouting to her colleagues, "Where's Ornt? Where is Ornt?" Anyway, impersonal to the point of dehumanization, right? This is a problem with institutions, and one reason, and this is work that we're doing now, why people might prefer other foundations of trust. They feel more authentic, right? It feels authentic to trust someone because you're part of the same group or because you have a relationship with them. They can, of course, bake in bias and discrimination, and we know this especially in the American context, where the way the legal system and the way the police function are inherently racially biased, often for longstanding historical reasons, and that's a problem because then they're not providing an equal basis for trust for all members of a society. They can ossify, so an institution that works great when it's founded might, over time, become less effective. And Francis Fukuyama, a political scientist famous for The End of History, has written quite a bit about this, that institutions like the American Park Service, which were wonderful innovations at the time, have ossified. They've become unable to cope with modern challenges. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that with the advent of AI, where American agencies, not just American, government agencies like NIST, which exists to create regulations and standards for technology, are going to have a really hard time adapting because they weren't created to do that. And institutions can be captured. And this is where I hope I don't offend too many people by saying some people call the Supreme Court of the United States the Supreme Court of the Republican Party, because you could argue it's been captured by one identity group, right? So it now no longer functions really as an impartial institution. It's really just representing a group and therefore not able to serve the function it ideally would. These ideas are all in a recent paper that we wrote, talks a little bit more about some other things as well, like neurons, but how norms and institutions shape group cooperation, if you're interested in learning more about it. And fundamentally, what I'm arguing is sort of general proposition, these forms of trust are related to each other, and that to some degree they're partially substitutable, so that when there's a lack of effective institutions, people will often turn to other forms or foundations of trust like shared group identities or parochialism. And for that reason, sticking to the American context, it should potentially concern us that trust in most institutions, if not all, is at probably the lowest level it's been in a very long time. There are lots of interesting consequences, implications of this, which I won't spend a huge amount of time going into, but before Twitter was X, and it was just Twitter, and I was still on it, this popped up in my feed, supposedly based on my likes, and I'm not sure what I've been liking to elicit it, but I think it's actually a great example of how this interplay between institutions, identities, and relationships might play out on something like social media platforms. So the tweet says, "My friends and I only talk shit about people who deserve it. We aren't gossips, we're vigilantes." To which someone replied, "Some people and things deserve to be hated on. I don't make the rules." And although I don't know why it suggests this to me, I do like it because I think, indicates something really interesting, which is at least a hypothesis that we're playing with, that our social media platforms are still institutionally very weak. We don't have good mechanisms for regulating social interactions on social media platforms. If somebody's harassed, if you observe something really objectionable, you can report it. Nothing happens, right? At least almost ever. And for that reason, what we see on social media platforms is a lot of what's sometimes called cancel culture, but fundamentally it's shaming. It's about invoking norms to shape behavior. And that's very groupy, right? So the institution lacks a good mechanism, and so we rely on groups instead. All right, so to bring this back to the broader topic of the conference, and I realize I'm asking you to do lots of cognitive work, really, which is to figure out how what I'm talking about actually maps onto the things you're talking about. But all sorts of things we know impact people's willingness and the decisions they make to help others, right? Whether it's through charitable giving, stopping to help a stranger in pain, volunteering, right? A whole set of things, many more than on this list. The ones I highlighted in red are things that I heard mentioned today, and I'm sure there are others that were mentioned that I wasn't in the room for. But empathy, the warm glow effect, social recognition, having an identifiable victim, cultural values, incentives, proximity, right? People give, or science giving is primarily within the state the donor is in, right? From the very first talk of the day. All of these things influence helping in a variety of complicated ways. And I think trust plays a role in at least a couple of different ways. One potential role it could play in at least some of these relationships, and in some cases there's evidence for it, in other cases it's just a hypothesis, is almost like a moderating variable, right? So to the degree that you have a personal connection with someone, or a cause, or an organization, that is probably associated with greater trust. And that trust is probably associated with a more willingness to cooperate, to put yourself on the line, to make yourself vulnerable. Proximity, we know, can increase trust. Social norms can increase it, they can also decrease it. Inequality, we heard early this morning as well, is probably associated, or could plausibly be associated with less prosociality due to a reduction in trust in societies. So that's one way, as a type of a mediating variable. But the other way is trust as a more contextual variable. Something that's just sort of in the ether, the atmosphere, the context in which people are making these sorts of decisions. So for example, people may be more likely to feel empathy toward people who they trust, right? More likely to empathize, and there's certainly evidence for this, empathize with people who are part of a group that they share, right? And it's that common group membership and the trust they feel because of it that then causes to empathize with someone who's suffering some sort of plight. Cultural values could have a differential influence depending on trust, and so on. So with that, I'll conclude and say thanks very much, and acknowledge a set of co-authors and co-conspirators who've contributed to this work. And what's not on the slide and should be is funding from the NSF and the Templeton Foundation. So thanks very much.
Dominic, are you ready to take a few questions? Is
Yeah,
that good?
absolutely.
Great, great. We have a microphone, so please raise your hand. So I'll start off. And when you were talking about institutions, I was also thinking about culture and how you didn't actually speak up, but I'm thinking about the rise of these national level institutions also came alongside the creation of nations and these new kind of broad identities that transcended more parochial ones as well. So, and when you think about the current environment as institutional trust is going down, we're having all these battles around who we are at that national level. What's your sense of the role of that large level culture, those dynamics?
So that's a great question. I think there's definitely a relationship there. So when I talk about this work with social identity people, which is sort of my in-group academically, the most frequent and vehement comment I get is institutions are just identities, right? Like, what's different than what we've been talking about for 50 years? To which I try to say, well, it's not exactly the same. Like, where's the rules and the procedures in our literature? We're not talking about that. But I do think identities are often essential for building institutions, right? So when you think about the founding of a nation, that sense we have some common identity grounded in geography, grounded in common heritage, grounded in traditions and narratives of our past provides us some of the fuel and the impetus to build a solid set of institutions. It's one of the motivating factors. And so I've been talking about how identities and institutions can, to some degree, substitute for each other, but I think actually every one of these interrelationships can go both ways. Sometimes they're mutually substitutable and sometimes they're mutually reinforcing. And so identities can provide a basis for creating institutions, a reason for people to care about them. One thing that's unique in some ways about the United States is when you ask people, at least if you went back a while and asked people what's most important about the United States, they talk about the institutions. They'd say, like, the most important thing about the United States is the Constitution. That's not true in most nations, right? They'll talk about the land they're on, or the 2,000-year-old history, or whatever it might be. I'm not sure Americans would answer in the same way. I haven't asked lately. But it's also the case that identities can be destructive of institutions, right? We see that, I think, I probably have a slide that might say it somewhere. Shared identities can trump relational bonds, right? So this is the Thanksgiving problem we're now all confronting, right? We go to dinner with family members who we used to get along with really well, and suddenly our political identities are driving us apart, where people are willing potentially to overthrow democracy because something more parochial seems more important. So it's a really important question, how these things interrelate.
So I was hoping, within the context of the presentation, I was wondering if this was what the book is about. How do we build trust or rebuild trust? I know we can all think of ourselves as part of the same soccer team. Are there other kind of interventions that you've seen through writing this book that are related to building trust?
Yeah, also a really great question. And the answers aren't terribly satisfying, because I think the more fraught the situation is, the more difficult it is. Part of it is relational, right? So there's research showing that if you can actually get people to talk to each other, despite political divisions or other divisions, if they actually have meaningful conversations, it does help, right? People do sort of get past those and realize they have more in common than they'd suspected. There's work, including work by Senator Conrath here, that if you can get people to recognize that their perceptions of difference are often exaggerated, and this is actually true. Most Americans and other nationalities' perceptions of what people politically different from themselves, what they actually think, is often quite dramatically different from what they actually think. If you can help people see that and realize it, it can help. I think identities can play a role. So we've done studies over the years where we put people in teams or other situations where they're members of two groups come together in some common identity, and it can change biases. The most compelling example of it that I know of was a study conducted by an assistant professor now at Yale, Salma Musa, in the political science department, where she did a common identity intervention in northern Iraq in communities that had been deeply divided between the Christian members of the community and the Muslim members of the community. ISIS had come in, had devastated these communities. The Christian communities had generally fled to refugee camps. When they came back, after ISIS was sort of removed from the region, they came back to discover their homes destroyed. And so it was an incredibly difficult situation and huge tension between these two communities. And what she did as her dissertation research was, speaking of soccer, assign randomly teenage boys in these communities to play soccer for the summer, either on a same religious team, so only with members of their own religious group, or on mixed religion teams with members of the other religious group. And what she found was that the kids who'd played on these mixed religion teams were, after that summer, significantly more open to, friendly towards, willing to interact with members of this other religious group, despite an incredibly fraught environment. And I think the most interesting finding in that paper, which is in Science, that she didn't make a big deal of, but seems like a big deal to me, is that that effect is strongest for the teams that did well. So the soccer teams that won, if they're mixed religion, that's where things really improved. And I think there's something important there, because if you're part of a group or team with people who are different from yourselves, but you're working effectively together and actually succeeding together, I think it goes a long way. And then the third thing, I think, is institutions. I think we have to pay attention to it. The institutions that shape the context we're in, which includes some of the incentives that, for example, our social media networks have or platforms have to amplify really toxic content. And my colleague Jay does extensive research on that. But also in the American context includes things like the primary system, which only something like 10% of people vote in primaries, which select the candidates the rest of us vote on for important elections. And primary voters are more extreme than everyone else. And so you end up with extreme candidates that don't particularly appeal to most people, but nevertheless, that's what we've got. And there's extensive research in political science on how that, as an institution, contributes to some of the toxic dynamics we have. So, not a very satisfying answer, because there's nothing simple about any of those things. But. So if we could beat the aliens, maybe. So Jay and I, we wrote the book. We'd finished the book more or less. No, that's not true. We were in the midst of writing the book when the COVID-19 pandemic broke out. And we, rather unfortunately, are in print saying that the COVID-19 pandemic was like an alien invasion that would bring society together. And of course it didn't. It made it significantly worse, I think, actually, polarization, especially in America. And maybe it's because it's not aliens and it's hard to see a little virus as an enemy. It's hard to know who won, exactly. But it turns out my postdoc advisor, Marilyn Brewer, who's amazing in many ways, had a paper from the 1990s where she'd predicted in a footnote that Jay and I were wrong in 2020. So she was happy to point that out.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture, and thanks for visiting SPI. Kind of two things. One, I would love to hear how you define trust. You've talked a lot about trust, and I've just never heard a definition. And two,
That's fair.
Construct validity is something important in your literature. I saw you talk about the trust game.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about public goods games. Maybe you talked about other sharing games. I'd love to hear you connect your definition to those games that you're citing and convince us that it has construct validity.
That's a very valid point. I'll admit, for the purpose of the talk, I used the word trust rather loosely. I do think there's distinctions that could profitably be made between the different operationalizations, in part because people's responses in these different games, as well as questions about how much do you trust this person, don't always correlate that highly with each other. My definition of trust, which I struggle with and I'm open to other definitions, but is generally the willingness to make oneself vulnerable in one way or another to another person or set of people. In the case of a trust game, it's here are some resources which you could choose to reciprocate or not. In the case of a romantic relationship, it might be saying, I love you to the person who hasn't yet said that to you, and trusting, hoping that they say it back, right? So it is a rather fuzzy definition.
Feels like risk aversion to me. So the way that you've defined it is highly correlated with willing to take risks. And I didn't think that was
Sure.
necessarily what you wanted to get at.
So how would you
but maybe
define
you
it?
did. Oh, I didn't write a book. I don't. But it's,
To be fair, I didn't write the book about trust, but yes, it is fuzzy. Is it just risk aversion? Maybe it's a form of social risk aversion.
taking chances on another person's actions that determine your payoffs.
Yeah.
But then I would love you to speculate on how we can leverage trust in our fundraising. So Joe Buck is an old good friend of
Yeah.
mine. He used to be in charge of fundraising at Lehigh. Now he went out to Oregon.
Yeah.
In fact, I worked with Joe a lot at Booth.
Yeah.
I would love for you to tell us, we're just mere mortals trying to figure out how to do things right. I'd love for you to give us some direction on either science we can do or things that might work to enhance the pie.
Well, I'm a mere mortal as well, and I don't have any great answers, I'm afraid. But I mean, when I talk to donors, as in my very limited fundraising experience, which is really just beginning at this point in my career, I do think trust is a component of the puzzle. I think, and university fundraising is a particular context, but they are looking for relationships with people that feel authentic. And my experience with at least some fundraising operations is they're not terribly authentic. I think that's a challenge, right? It can feel like a bit of a machine. They know they're being researched. They know they're being cultivated in particular ways. And I'm not sure that always resonates as a trusting relationship. It feels very transactional. So that would be one thing I do talk about with our fundraising folks. I sometimes feel uncomfortable with the advice they give me on how I should talk to potential donors. It just doesn't feel real enough. Group identities play a huge role in fundraising, certainly in the university context, right? The alumni base is usually the dominant source of donations. It's a little different probably at Booth. Certainly at Lehigh, 95% of our donors are alums. And so we're capitalizing on that identity. But as that identity ebbs and flows, it makes a difference. I think a lot of our alums, so Lehigh was a male-only school until 1974. We still, I mean, they're aging out now, but certainly have alums who will routinely say, that was the end of the old Lehigh, and why should I give my money today, right? That felt like the identity shifted on them. And I think that's one of the challenges universities currently face in our political environment as they're seeking to navigate many complicated political challenges. Some of the people they're asking for money have pretty different views on what their function should be. I don't have an answer for that, but I think it's something you have to try to navigate. And then on the institutional side, I think people are looking increasingly, this is what I hear, for signals that things are being well managed and run. So I'm the Associate Vice Provost for Research at Lehigh, so we handle all of our sponsored research. Obviously, every grant proposal that goes in has an extensive budget and budget justification. We were asked 2 weeks ago by our fundraising group to collaborate with them so they can prepare the similar kinds of budgets and justifications to show to donors. Because what they're hearing today, which they didn't used to hear, is show me the budget. Like, how are you actually going to use it? Line item by line item, and show me how it fits into the broader institutional investment in whatever cause it is I'm contributing to. And to me, that smacks of a sort of institutional kind of trust, right? I want to know that you're actually going to do what you say you're going to do, and you're going to use my money wisely. That's a very specific thing. And I don't know much about fundraising beyond the university context. I'm sure it's different in other contexts, but those are the things that I see how this sort of scholarship intersects with that task. Yeah.
As John was speaking, I was thinking about, you mentioned that, how every pitch you get on your phone or in the email is trying to get you to think about the product or the service they want to sell you as becoming part of your identity, right? So you do have Ferrari owning or Honda owning clubs that product or that service becomes part of their identity. And in some ways, we try to do that in the social sector, and we have a leg up on them because usually what we're selling has some good and social benefit connected to that. So, so are there other clues in terms of when kind of the manufacturing of identity can work? Are there clues to help us not be inauthentic, and how do you help interpret the world so that folks will kind of share their identity with you?
That's a really fabulous question as well, and I think identity is a bit of a paradox in the sense that I think they're easy to create and hard to sustain, in the sense that the most replicable, robust effect I have ever studied is the minimal group effect, which is you more or less randomly assign people to a group they've never heard of before, they've never interacted with anyone in that group before, they never will, and yet they immediately feel a sort of positivity, a bond, and a trust toward that social category. And it can be as trivial as you're on the Lions or the Tigers, you're a yellow team member or a blue team member, but I don't think those last. What I think that is, psychologically, is a readiness we have to affiliate. And if there's an opportunity, we seize upon it to see what'll happen next. You can also do this experimentally, and these were studies that were done in the 1950s. If you tell someone, someone comes into the lab, they fill out a little questionnaire about themselves. You say, I'm just going to take your questionnaire and show it to the person in the next room. And then you come back a minute later and say, oh, they read your questionnaire, and they think they'll like you. That person's liking for that person they've never met jumps through the roof, right? The sense, oh, this person's going to like me, I really like them, right? Despite knowing nothing about them, right? We have this readiness to affiliate, but I think the challenge is to turn that into something actually meaningful. I think we're willing to try out the opportunity, but not necessarily carry on with that if it doesn't feel like it's real, or it really is an opportunity for trust, or the other person really is going to reciprocate. And so I think when we get these messages that are trying to use an identity that we may possess, or they want to create a new one, they've got to deliver in some way that makes it feel like an authentic thing. There's a concept in social psychology which has the worst name in the world, which is entitativity. It's got a syllable it really shouldn't have in the middle, but it's the degree to which a group feels like an entity. And it turns out that that's a really strong predictor of how much people identify with it. Like, do we have common fate? Do we have common views? Do we have common values? And some groups feel like they really have that, and that inspires a lot of identification. Other groups kind of lack that, and then it doesn't. Yeah.
Right? So you do those three things that like make people want to stick with the group a little bit more. One more time, because I think we're thinking about renewals, which is one of the most difficult parts of fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Maybe those three things are something we should be looking at more.
Yeah, so one of them is common fate, a sense that we're in it together for one reason or another. Like, we are all experiencing something in common, which could be the same distress at the disaster we're observing, overseas, or the same, so something is uniting us in terms of a common experience. Second is, I think, a sense that so shared values, I think, are important. I'm trying to remember. I'll get back to you with a better list. These are things I'm remembering from a long time ago. The concept of entitativity actually comes from visual perception, which is probably not the best analogy, but it's what inspired the concept in the first place. So one of the challenges in studying visual perception is understanding how to, when I look at that table, understand that it's one object, right? It's actually hitting all sorts of different neurons in my eye. My brain's having to do a lot of work to make me see it as one thing. And there's a set of principles that are known to make it such that our brains calculate that is in fact an object. One of them is common fate. If you move the table, the whole thing moves, not like part of it is left behind. So it's based on those principles. And I am now rambling because I don't recall as many of them as I should, but I can look them up and let you know. But I think it's a really good point that to the degree you want people to identify with a group, it needs to feel like a group. And that's one of the things we do talk about in the book, is that there's a difference between a group and a collection of people. And the story I tell in the book is of a time I was on a flight up the East Coast to the United States, and normally when on a plane, right, there's a whole set of people there, 50, 100, 200 people, but you're not a group, right? You're just a set of people sharing the same space temporarily. Psychologically, that's not a group. On this flight, it was really stormy, and the pilot, it was a little plane, so it's a lot of turbulence. He navigated up through between the storms. It was actually really remarkable, and we were all kind of freaking out. And it was one of the only flights I've ever been on where everyone started talking to each other. And at the end, everyone clapped when we landed. And for a moment, we felt like a group, like we'd been through something together. And I think that's that sense of common fate. And so if you've got an organization and you want people to identify with it, it's got to be more than just a label or, hey, we're a set of people who donated to the same thing, but we're somehow a group of people that have something in common, and we're working together toward the same cause.
Hi. I'm going to go a little off the conference theme. I'm pretty convinced that you've talked ways that we can apply this to fundraising and philanthropy. I'm going to go the other way, how a philanthropy learns from you to apply to other things. It seems like, we're in a pretty difficult state politically, polarization, and it seems like groups are strategically trying to destroy alternative bases of identity. I wanted you to comment on any literature on the strategic use of destroying other identities by one identity. So, for example, we no longer rely on the force of established law in the Supreme Court. We're free to overturn anything. And other institutions that might build trust are also being made, attacked by one group.
Yeah. I mean, the work that comes most readily to mind, and I'm sure there's other things, is work by Linda Skitka, who's a moral psychologist who studies something called moral mandates. And what she argues is that as issues become moralized, it changes the sort of cost-benefit calculus that people apply to their behavior, such they're then willing to treat things as means to an end that they otherwise wouldn't, right? And so you might think, well, the rule of law is important, but my moral principle regarding X issue, whatever it might be, is more important than that, and so I'm willing to sacrifice it. And I think, to me, that's often what the dynamic is that people are, in addition to having very strong political identities at the moment, many of the issues swirling around those identities are deeply moralized, right? It's right or wrong, therefore, there's no gray, there's no room for compromise, and whatever it takes to win is necessary. And to the degree people feel that, it's incredibly difficult to reason.
That's a strategy for enforcing within group, but not exactly a strategy for destroying alternative groups. I think a lot of the questionable facts that are being circulated are designed to make people stop trusting one of their identities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know of work that's directly looking at that. I mean, generally speaking, attacks of that kind are often pretty ineffective because they're coming from outsiders. And so the challenge is, how can you do it in a way that doesn't immediately trigger resistance, right? So there's work on what's called the intergroup sensitivity effect, which shows that, generally speaking, criticism of a group really does nothing if it's coming from the outside. People are very easily resist that. So much so that the effect also applies to in-group members who seem like less one of us. So newcomers can't criticize the group. People who are different from the norm can't criticize the group. So what we see, though, certainly after the 2016 election, a lot of the Russian propaganda efforts to disrupt what was happening were of that sort of in-groupy nature. So they were playing both sides, right? There were things on Facebook, for example, clearly we now know were Russian influence operations, some of which were very pro-right causes, and others which were very pro-left causes. And they were designed to stir up a lot of animosity by posing as members of both sides. So.
I think it was designed to destroy our identity as one country.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Okay, I guess it's my job as a co-organizer to come back to what we're here for the conference. I know that we want to talk politics, but I want to talk charity. And I'm going to come back to your games again, and I'm going to come back to your experimental games that you were bringing up during your lecture. And I'm going to make a conjecture, and I want you to tell me whether you think I'm right or wrong.
Sure.
So I think those games do have evidence that can help people in the room, but it's, let's say, the second player in a trust game. It's the second player in a sequential prisoner's dilemma game. It's the final mover in a lemons game. And that's about trustworthiness. And what all the charities or 501c3s can do is enhance their trustworthiness. And that's the element that is key for all of us in the room. You don't really talk about any of those data in your lecture.
Sure.
But when you do, maybe you can give us some insights about if you can signal your trustworthiness, does that bring about more trusting behavior, whether it's in a sequential PD or et cetera, et cetera? Does it bring out preferences that look like people want to give to your organization if you can signal that you're trustworthy. So that's my conjecture, that that's the true element in all of this that people here can leverage and use. I'd love to hear your response.
No, I
to
think that sounds absolutely right. So certainly in the games literature, in repeated games where the recipient of trust actually behaves in a trustworthy way, it tends to then elicit greater trust. Likewise, trusting elicits trustworthiness, right? So it turns out that partner B in a trust game is more likely to actually behave in a trustworthy way to the degree trust is placed in them. People also project. Untrustworthy people expect others to be less trustworthy, and then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Others turn out to be less trustworthy because they don't trust them as much. So these two things are deeply interrelated. I think your point is absolutely right, that one of the things we have to do as institutions, organizations seeking trust, is to be as trustworthy as we can be and to project that, right, to provide solid signals that that is in fact the case. What I don't know, because it's not my world of research, is what those signals would be in the philanthropic world, right? What is it, and I'm guessing it's an empirical question, what are those signals that would be most effective, right, for people who want to give to a particular kind of charity? Is it, people are concerned about overhead, right? Is fundamentally the concern there about trust, that if you're using 30% of my money in the black box of running the organization, I don't know what that's doing, right? So that seems like it could be one of those signals, but I think there's almost certainly more to it than that. Yeah.
Okay, we'll give the final question, I think, to this lady who raised her hand right now.
That's fascinating to see. Looks like you've been publishing with scientists from the Karolinska. Do you have somebody on your book? So Dr. Hans Rosling from MSF from the Karolinska used the term gapminder. And I state that now because we have so few scientists in Congress. We have Bill Foster from Illinois, for instance. But I think Rosling's work is what you're affiliating, the Trusted Voices campaigns. And what I'm thinking is the more vulnerable groups we have to attend to, the more we have to find those individuals that are trusted voices to whom we might think in idiosyncratic ways, but have to have partition. We have to suspend that. And so I'm just wondering if you maybe want to comment on his work.
Yeah, I think as a society, we've become much more attuned to the fact that we are composed of many different groups with different histories and different needs, needs that persist into the present, and that groups would like those identities to be recognized and honored as much as, say, a broad national identity. But it does pose a challenge. It's a tension between, there's real value in us seeing us as us, right? That there's a broad collective, at the same time as needing to recognize that different communities within the us face significant challenges. And there is a literature in social psychology which is very attuned to that dynamic on the relationship between sub and superordinate identities. And that members of groups, especially groups that have been historically marginalized, it's really important that those subgroup identities be recognized and honored, and that they speak for themselves in order for them to then feel like an important part of the broader collective. And what a really skilled leader is able to do, and there's work on what's called intergroup leadership, and I think it's a real skill that most leaders don't have, is they know how to navigate that. They can both provide a sense that, hey, we're all in it together, and yet that doesn't mean we're diminishing the identities of which we are composed, and that those matter too. So.
Well, as you're helping us successfully build the new SPY identity a little bit, I hope, with practitioners and researchers together. So please join me in a thank you to Dominic. And we will see you bright and early tomorrow morning for our second keynote, which will start us off tomorrow morning. So see you tomorrow.